Ladies and gentlemen,
We're going to go a little beyond 8 o'clock, given the delay in the commencement of the program. It's now my personal pleasure to introduce Mr. Paul Gigot, who is the moderator of our second panel. You have Paul's illustrious CV in your program notes. Very notably, he was recently named the editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, effective on September 17th. He has a weekly column on politics, which he started in 1987 and won the 2000 Pulitzer Prize for commentary. And many of us know him as he appears regularly on the public television as the political analyst on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. One thing that doesn't appear in Paul Gigot's biography in your program notes is that he was Mr. Baker's speechwriter at the Department of Treasury many years ago, and did a brilliant job in that capacity, I'm told by a source on background. We did our due diligence here at the Institute and decided that so many years have passed since that time that there's no conflict of interest in inviting him here to moderate this event. Let me make one other comment. The horrific terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center building on September 11 forced the Wall Street Journal to relocate its operations immediately in that critical zone. And Paul was instrumental in ensuring that the Wall Street Journal was able to publish its next edition the following day without any pause. And I think that was a good signal to the terrorists and those behind them that we're getting on with our work.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I would say about Secretary Baker, my time working with Secretary Baker was that he was such an aggressive editor of my work that I had to flee to the private sector. The topic of our second panel today is the view from Treasury: process, policy, and reform. So we are going to get into a little bit more of an aggressive give and take on some of the policy aspects as opposed to the politics, although I have a sneaking suspicion that politics will enter in too. And I want to start, again in the wake of September 11th, with the debate we're having in Washington right now, which is well underway, about fiscal policy. We are, as Secretary Regan said, probably in a recession. And members of both parties and the administration and Congress are now scrambling to come up with a fiscal policy, a mix of tax and spending, to help us out of that. And I wanted to start off by asking Secretary Regan to elaborate a little bit on a provocative statement you made earlier, which was that in this environment, we should slow down. What do you mean by that? And tell us, does that mean that fiscal policy can't work, or what?
Well, let me, let's say, bifurcate that remark into several areas. One, first of all, being that in the field of military and retaliation and things of that nature, I was not referring to that. What happens there, and that is beyond my purview at this point. And in the matter of relief, I think that when the relief of the people who have been injured, the people who have been, who have suffered losses there, people who have had great tragedies in their lives, I don't think we should slow down there. I think there should be immediate relief for all of them. Now, having come to that, we then come to the third part, which is the economy itself. Fiscal policy, as you know, is taking currently, well, probably 19–20% of gross domestic product. So it's a fifth of all we make and all we do. This has an enormous effect on the other 4/5, what we do with that fifth. To suddenly try to do something within a matter of several weeks, or to do it by a deadline of the middle of the month or something of that nature, I think is much too soon for deep policy that is going to have an effect not only on our immediate lives, but on our lives of years to come. If you just try to think back of some of the things we were discussing economically and fiscally, financially, in June, July, and August, And then look at it today. You don't hear about the same things, but nevertheless, those problems are still there. They have to be dealt with. But in the immediate future, we've got to deal with, let us try now to get out of whatever it is we're in. Call it recession, call it whatever you, slow down, whatever you want. We do have to take immediate steps, but we have to take wise steps. And it's been my experience in Washington as well as in Wall Street that if you make a hasty decision, chances are it's going to be a wrong decision. I think that you have to think through just how much money do you want to spend fiscally? How much of the budget do you really want to, if there is a surplus in the budget, how much of that do you really want to spend now? If there is to be a tax cut, and I certainly hope there is, what kind of a tax cut? What is the wisest thing to do? We've had many tax cuts in the history of the United States. Some of them have been good, some of them have been bad. I think we should profit from that experience. Is the marginal tax rate cut the best we can do? If it is, do it. If it isn't, let's see what else there is. But I think we do have to think this through very carefully and not rush to judgment on what to do fiscally, financially.
Secretary Rubin, you are a participant in some of these debates going on now. Responding to that, do you think that fiscal policy can stimulate the economy in the short term? And what kind of policies are going to be most effective at doing that?
I think in a word, Paul, I think that the distinction I think that one needs to make a distinction between our long-term fiscal position and our short-term fiscal position. I think it is absolutely critical that we preserve our long-term fiscal soundness to the extent that we can, which had already been substantially damaged by the Tax Cut Act in the spring, but that damage has been done. I think we need to preserve our fiscal position at the point at which it now exists, because I think that the more people have confidence in our long-term fiscal well-being, the more flexibility it gives us to deal with the short-term and to put in a fiscal stimulus without having a significant adverse impact, or at least in a way that would limit the adverse impact on interest rates. In terms of the short-term measures, I think that everything we do should be temporary. That is to say, it should have stimulative effect in 2002. There should be no meaningful costs in later years, and I think it should be substantial. I don't think we should try to achieve other agendas under the guise of dealing with September 12th. Within that context, I think the question is what gives you the greatest bang for the buck, and my view on that, Paul, is that I'm deeply involved with business activities since leaving Treasury. I think that what is deterring investment is basically the absence of consumer demand. Therefore, I think the focus should be on consumer demand, and I think that will be best promoted by rebates or some other temporary tax measure that deals with low and middle income taxpayers.
Secretary Schultz, you were around when rebates made their appearance many, many years ago in policy debates. I think I remember hearing about them in the 1970s. Any thoughts on his agenda?
Well, I have a little different view than has been expressed. I think when it comes to the broad rhythm of the economy, that the most important arena is monetary policy. And I think history shows that you can't spend your way out of recessions. Japan has been trying it all through the 1990s. It's a total failure. And we need to be looking, therefore, at monetary policy. And I read in the papers that Alan Greenspan was among those counseling go slow. But thankfully, he didn't go slow when it came to monetary policy. He acted practically simultaneously with the attack and flooded the economy with liquidity, and I think that was very good. And I believe that in the end, monetary policy will work, and we should recognize that that's the history of it. Now, I'd like to make one other point.
Sure.
Just from the economy standpoint, I think the thing that has hurt the most is the uncertainty created by the attack and the sense of vulnerability we never had before, which we now have. And therefore, I would say a principal thing the federal government should have on its mind is how to restore the comfort level, how to reduce that uncertainty. And I think you do it mostly by things they're doing, by having a good offense, going after these people, and doing it effectively, which I assume they're going to do. I think the signs are all good on that regard. But also in implementing measures that will give us comfort that we're secure. And the things that are going on in airplanes and airports, I think everybody is for those. I've experienced a little inconvenience in getting here, long lines, and I wish it had gone further, but anyway, you got to do that. There are a lot of pipelines and transmission lines and so forth that are very vulnerable. You got to look to things like that. There are a lot of nuclear power plants around you got to pay attention to. There are targets that make people nervous, and we should do things that give people assurance that the uncertainty that's created can be dissipated. And I think once that happens, then you get back to, let's say, a pre-September 11th situation, which in my view was one where the economy was in very poor shape and needed help, and then you can debate about that.
Are you saying that the best fiscal policy at the present juncture may be a sound foreign and military policy? Is that to reassure people, and you don't really need to do anything on the tax and the spending side?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I do think that the two big things are monetary policy and security.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to add one sentence because I think I actually basically agree with George's construct. I think the fiscal measures I was talking about is what I thought ought to be done within the context of whatever stimulus is going to be in the short term, but I think that the factors that George was talking about are substantially more important than whatever we do fiscally, though I would have a little less confidence than he would in the effect of monetary policy.
And what George was talking about, if I can interpret it correctly, is not just foreign and military policy, but convincing the American people that we are winning the war on terrorism, both internationally and at home, is the most important thing I think we can do to restore our economy. We can debate all sorts of fiscal stimulative measures, we can debate tax measures and other things, but in my opinion, those are going to be effective more at the margins, and the most important thing we can do is show that we're winning the war on terrorism.
And have a very accommodative monetary policy, which we have.
That's absolutely right.
And it could go a little further.
Does anybody up here disagree with that and say that we do need at this juncture a more aggressive fiscal policy?
Well, I have a slightly different view. I think you have to be careful that we don't attribute everything that seems to worry us right now to the events of September 11th. Actually, if you analyze what's going on in the economy and the statistics that we have before us now, 75 or 80% of it was already cooked into the economy at this particular point in time. I think it's a very big mistake to say that what we should do now in terms of looking at our economy is really should only be looked at as though it was something that happened on September 11th. That's not the case. It was already headed down, and I think it's a big mistake to lump it all into one piece. The difference of view I have, however, I start a little farther back. I think you have to analyze why we are where we are. And in my view, it may be one I hold only by myself, but what we're involved in now is reversing out of a boom or putting a bubble in reverse, and there aren't any resident scholars on that subject. The resident scholars are all have dealt with things much different than what faces us today, in my view, which is how do we reverse out of a bubble? So feeling that when the wealth destruction that's taken place in the last year, because the markets were so overblown, that what you have to do is, and I think it's quite large, and it's liable to affect pretty quickly the consumer of last resort. That's the consumer in the United States. Don't forget that the 2/3 of the GNP comes from consumer expenditures. So my view, I think I would disagree with George and Bob to some extent. I would hit it with a 2x4. I think monetary policy has been great. My feeling that the earlier tax cut was good too. But I think now we ought to have, you've got certain expenditures which will come from Homeland Defense, which will add an impetus to the economy. But I would add on top of that other things. It'll start a scramble in Congress as to what kind, but I think we ought to do some fiscal spending at this time. I would be careful at the same time not to observe Bob Rubin's principle, which is in the long term, make sure that our fiscal stability that we now have and work so hard on isn't disrupted. But I would hit it in a number of different areas. I might even abolish the payroll tax for the next 3 quarters. Next 3 months, excuse me. And so I would hit it in a number of different ways. I do feel, because it started way back, and it's a phenomenon we don't understand, there are no resident scholars, that we ought to hit it in a number of different areas.
Secretary Miller, is there any additional role for tax policy here?
Well, I think when we look at the overall situation, one of our primary problems, as has been said, is to restore confidence. And that relates to dealing with the terrorists and creating domestic security, but it also is necessary to build confidence that people will have jobs, will be able to support their family, will be able to have normality. Now, in a normal business cycle, in my view, the best business cycle medicine, economic policy, would be one in which there is a above normal activity. We should run surplus physically, and when there's a recession, we should be willing to accept the deficit. But moving the economy in normal times is easier through monetary policy because it's nimble. It can be put in quickly in either direction, and it can be removed quickly. It doesn't necessarily commit to this long-term, we've done something physically, now we can't change it. But these are not normal times. The softness of the economy was there, as Nick points out. But this event, this exogenous event, has driven confidence down, and we could have a snowball where we never get out of this hole if we don't not only build confidence and security, but confidence in our capacity to deal with the economic issues. And think about spending for a moment. There's mandatory spending. We've got to deal with taking care of the victims, individuals, families, businesses, and rebuild. We've got to spend money for the anti-terrorist campaign and for creating domestic security. The issues are, it's expensive to establish the domestic security we need. And the other thing you may need in spending is to strengthen the safety net from the people who've been thrown out of this because, not of a business cycle, because of some violent action. And that 3 expenditures probably was all we should do. Then when one could say, well, is there anything, as Nick suggests, that more we should do to build that confidence and get back on a path of growth? If so, which should be in the tax area, and if it is done, it should probably be temporary, so that answering Don's concern about acting in haste, act in haste, repent at leisure, we shouldn't act hastily, but we should be willing to act promptly and make it temporary so we have time to re-examine whether or not we want permanent changes. We should look at it as a limited activity to give us the rebuilding the confidence in moving the economy.
Secretary Blumenthal, you want to get in here?
I want to get in there, not really to disagree with anybody, but just to point out that this is really a period that is fraught with risk for the policymaker. There is, I think, a great risk that in our effort to repair the psychological damage of the 11th of September and to try to deal with the uncertainty that has been created and to try to restore consumer confidence, all of which is very important, we lose sight of the fact that until rather recently, perhaps Democrats and Republicans can argue when the decisive moment of change occurred, until very recently, we were on a pretty good wicket. We had a surplus for the first time in I don't know how many years.
We were doing well. We had a high rate of employment, very low rate of unemployment, very low rate of inflation. And I think Democrats and Republicans together agreed that we were doing some things right. The reason why it's so important to not overshoot and not overreact is apparent if you watch Washington even as we speak. With all the lobbyists again descending and wishing to use this opportunity in the fiscal policy area and other policy areas to say, fellows, we're in an emergency and we've got to do things. And you know what they want to do with the things they've been wanting to do for a long time.
Well, wait a minute,
And therefore, my last point is the most important thing we must do as we decide on what policy measures to follow. First of all, try to get a few more statistics under our belt, because we don't really know exactly where we are, but to do something that is temporary, not to overshoot, and to be careful that we don't allow ourselves to use this opportunity to fund all of our little pet projects, which will really permanently take us off the good wicket that we have been on until now.
But when I was in school reading textbooks, I was taught, reading Lord Keynes, that emergencies were precisely the time when you did not run a balanced budget, precisely the times when you would spend or you would cut taxes. Are you saying that, all of you saying we have learned something perhaps, that maybe Keynes is dead as an economic policy maker? Or is, because there certainly are risks to the surplus.
I use the word overshoot. That doesn't mean not to shoot at all.
I think the experience has shown that the kind of reliance on budget deficits and spending and so forth that was associated with Keynesianism just doesn't work. It's not an ideological matter. It just hasn't worked out. And monetary policy has worked. That doesn't mean it's irrelevant to look at the budget. And it doesn't seem to me there's a problem, because you don't have to think up new ideas for spending money. They're coming at you at a tremendous rush. And what the budget director has to do and the Treasury Secretary have to do is kind of get their arms around those things and keep it from going totally out of control. In the meantime, I think there is a legitimate debate about tax policy. And I was interested that Bob thinks that something should be done on tax policy, so we're in agreement on that. I would go in a little different direction, and I think our rates are too high. And how about this for an idea? You move the rates that are already scheduled, you don't like them, but they're there, up. And at the same time, you try to take a page out of the 1986 Tax Act book and look around for preferences that have crept back in and try to eliminate them so that you make the moving up of the rate reductions revenue neutral.
Secretary Rubin, isn't that what I'm sure a president you revere, John F. Kennedy, did, cutting marginal tax rates in the 1960s?
Well, I didn't say I revered President Kennedy, but
no,
nor did I say I didn't. Let's go back to George's. Suggestion. Whether you want to deal with preferences or not, I have a feeling that that's a subject we tried it, and I guess every Treasury tries it, and it's very tough. George, I wouldn't move up the rates. I've actually done the numbers on this. If you take the existing rate schedule, which is correct, I would not have put the changes that were done in the spring, and you move them up to the current, it would cost about, I think, $136 billion or something like that, for which you would get about $26 billion worth of tax cuts in 2002. So it is an extremely inefficient way, I think, to create stimulus in 2002, if that is your purpose. So I would not take that approach.
Now you know why I said go slow. I think that there are many ideas that have merit. I think there are many things that can be done to get us out of the recession. Although monetary policy is good, and the Fed has acted wisely over the past year or so, I do think that monetary policy on its own is not enough. I think that there is another horse to draw this wagon, and that horse is fiscal policy. And I think fiscal policy, since it's divided into two things, one is spend and one is receive, we should look, since we're former secretaries of the Treasury at the receive side. I think that while there's a rush in Congress to do the spending, that we should slow the Congress down as much as possible in order to see what sort of a tax cut you can do. If you want to restore confidence to people, put money in their pocket. That's the best way to restore confidence. A person with money in his pocket is much better off than someone who is having money taken out of his pocket. So I'm all for marginal tax cut rates, even if on a temporary basis. I see nothing wrong with what we did in 1981. We started out to do 10-10-10, and we ended up doing 5-10-10. Well, what's wrong with a 5% or a 10% tax cut immediately for everybody? I'm not talking now about giving back or a negative tax type of thing. All of that can be handled on the margins. But what I'm talking about is if you want to get the majority of American people feeling more confident, give them a better paycheck.
It will come as no surprise to you, Paul, or others, that I would agree with the idea of accelerating the marginal rate reductions. But what I said earlier was that I think the biggest key here to restoring the economy is perceived and actual success in the war on terrorism, whether it's on the home front, whether it's internationally. A part of that confidence building would be a suitable package of fiscal measures. There'll be a big debate over what the makeup of that package should be. How much should be in tax relief, perhaps, how much in spending, and if there's anything in taxes, what the nature of the taxes are going to be. But my own personal view is while those things are important, and we should do them now because we are in an unprecedented situation, the really important thing that has to happen in terms of rebuilding confidence is we have got to show success internationally and at home in the war on terrorism. And that's going to mean, as George pointed out, that we're going to have to suffer some inconveniences that we didn't have to go through before in terms of long lines and perhaps some erosion of civil liberties, and we're going to have to do a whole lot of things that we didn't used to like to do, like getting our hands dirty with human intelligence and a whole host of other things.
All right. Let's shift gears a little to overall tax policy and tax reform, because as was said earlier, several members up here were instrumental in passing major tax reforms. Others proposed them, tried to get them through. But as I look back at the 1986 Act and what you did so much to try to enact into law, since then we have had, well, maybe not a tax bill every year, but maybe every other year. And much of the achievement, including the lower rates, has been eroded or altered. And I wonder if we are doomed, therefore, constantly, when you are as Treasury Secretary and you try to get something done, to constantly be fiddling with the tax code. Is there ever some kind of major seminal tax reform that we can get that would end this constant changing year after year, or is this just a part of the turf in an American democracy?
Let me take a quick shot at it since I was there for the '86 tax reform. I saw Bill Bradley this summer, and he and I were commiserating over the fact that what we did in '86 has been undone. And it's been undone not just by jacking up rates, but it's been undone by creating new preferences and deductions. And I'm not at all sure that you can stop the imperative, particularly on the part of the Congress, to want to get a tax bill every year. It's the one thing that turns people on at home politically, and they're going to continue to put stuff in the hopper. Your question was, can we ever really get back to fundamental tax reform? I think maybe so, but it's going to take some really strong presidential leadership, and it's probably going to be a while before we get there.
I was just going to say, I think you know the answer to your question, don't you? Taxation is all about whose ox is being gored. That's the essence of politics. And even if an administration, if a Secretary of the Treasury does not wish to have a tax bill every year or have to deal with taxes every year, the Congress will certainly do that. It's just part of the administration of government. The question is how frequently and how effectively we have to deal with what is known as fundamental tax reform, and whether or not our present system of income taxation, upon which our tax system is based, is the best and the most efficient, or whether there's a better way to do it. That's an issue, of course, that is occasionally debated. People have all kinds of ideas about flat taxes or consumption taxes and what have you, and that's a big question. I think perhaps that's one that secretaries of the Treasury are going to have to face in the future.
Well, Secretary Brady, I remember when you were Secretary, your Treasury produced a very well-researched, persuasive, at least to a lot of us, study on corporate taxation, if I'm not mistaken. Does that, is some kind of reform of that kind possible? There are a lot of economists who believe that corporations don't pay taxes at all, that they go to shareholders, their employees, consumers.
Well, I remember the study, Paul, but it seems to me that it was a good idea and something to bring forward, but the idea that it would ever happen just is so far-fetched that I could never get attached to it. I personally would leave the corporate tax rate where it is right now, but I mean, in terms of abolishing the corporate tax and therefore double taxation, I think it's a great idea, but it's just not going to happen, so I could never get my mind around it.
Yes, Secretary.
I think we have to keep aspiring to have a tax system that makes sense from the standpoint of collecting the revenue that's needed, and makes sense from the standpoint of not distorting the economy so tremendously as our present tax code does. The costs of this tax code are just gigantic. So I think we have to keep our aspiration up there, whether it looks like now is the time or not. And so it seems to me secretaries of the Treasury ought to have studies going. They ought to make proposals. They ought to be part of the discussion and the work in various private bodies that work on different proposals to simplify the tax system are very important, because, at least in the experience I've had in various fields, you never know when the opportunity comes. And the opportunity can come, and if you're not ready for it, it goes and you missed it. But if you're ready, then
sometimes the opportunity is there and you can actually get something to happen.
One of the things that I would add to what George has just said is that among the studies that have been done repeatedly, but I hope to goodness that we don't waste any more time on it, is the value-added tax system that has proven so onerous in foreign countries. And I also hope that we never try to get into a consumption tax. The more I study those types of taxes, the more I agree with George. I think ours, for all its impediments to good economy and to good business, is still the best system there is. But I do think it can be flattened out in this respect, that, as Jim Baker has been remarking, there are too many preferences in the tax code, and it has become arcane. I used to pride myself, maybe it's my age now, but I can no longer do my own income taxes. I used to pride myself that I could. Now, why? Why is it that an average mentally deficient elder cannot come out and do his own taxes?
Can anybody here? I can't do mine.
Well, there's the thing. It has become so complicated. I think that it's because of these preferences, and I think because of those, many of them can be eliminated. However, I caution, the fall of 2001 is not the time to try it. This is not the time for tax reform. But I do think that George is right. The secretaries of the Treasury, among other things, should have studies going. And I think there should be these things that are ready for it. But my opinion, it should come strictly from the current tax code and how to clean it up, rather than add on an entire new system.
Paul, the key statistic, I think, that leads you somewhat to a conclusion is the amount that the federal government takes out of the national economic pie. And if I'm not mistaken, we're right at the top level that has ever been. I don't know if it's greatly more than it was. Maybe, Bob, you remembered more than I do, what exactly it is. But I think tax reforms one way or the other are important, but the one figure to keep your eye on is that the federal government take out of the GNP is not excessive, and it's pretty near there right now.
Trying to remember the numbers, Nick. It went up a lot in the 90s because we had such an extraordinarily good economy, and there were tremendous capital gains and bonuses and one thing and another, and there was a lot of income in more highly taxed areas. But I don't recollect the number anymore. On the other hand, spending had come down as a percentage of GDP, which is, of course, why we started to develop surpluses.
I think if you take the personal income tax and the Social Security payroll tax, add them together, and express it as a percentage GDP, it's at the highest level it's ever been right now. But that was not my argument. So I agree with that argument, but my argument was the code is so complicated, and the costs of administering it and of to the taxpayer of carrying it out have become very significant. And it's just a total burden that does nothing for anybody.
That's why it's going to be so hard to get away from it. One reason it's going to be so hard is because there's so many interest groups that have a stake in that tax code. I mean, we talk here about, I think I agree there's not a chance for fundamental tax reform for some time. I think I said that. We talk about the importance of getting a more simplified tax system, a more efficient tax system, and yet we're not willing to consider a flat tax or a consumption tax. I disagree with Don Regan. I think a consumption tax is something that we ought to look at. But I recognize, as everybody on this dais does, the political problems that are involved there. But it would seem to me there ought to be some way to design a flat tax or a consumption tax that meets the regressivity arguments or the fairness arguments that you're going to be met with in the political system. One thing I'm sure, the code we now have, and I sure agree with George Schultz on this, is a disaster. And we ought to be looking at some ways that we might be able to get out from under it or get away from it.
I'm glad you said that, Jim. There is a difference. I was about to observe the obvious. There's a difference between simplification, which we're all in favor of. We're all agreed it is a horribly complex system. None of us can do our tax return anymore alone. Between simplification and progressivity. I happen to believe, as I have ever since I was old enough to think about these things, that a progressive tax system is the right tax system. And unfortunately, in the political debate between different philosophies, the argument for simplification and the argument for progressivity have become mixed, so that a lot of people use simplifying to, I think Don just did, to say flatten it out. I want to simplify. I don't necessarily want to flatten it out, in the sense that people who make a lot of money pay the same percentage of tax as people who make very little money. I believe it's fair for people who make a lot of money to pay a higher rate than people in whatever form that is. I also want to make the point that I have always felt that taxing consumption actually has a lot going for it, because if I'm a very rich man, I've made a lot of money, what do I do with my money? It's invested. It's invested in some fashion or other, either in bonds or in stock. It creates jobs. That's a good thing. I shouldn't be taxed on that. But if I go and buy a yacht or 2 yachts or a G4 or whatever, then they ought to tax me and tax me heavily. So I think there's an argument, a philosophical argument for a consumption tax that is an interesting one that ought to be pursued. But whatever we do, I think it needs to be progressive.
That's a pretty good standard of living, 2 yachts and a G4. Wow.
And you should pay for that.
Back to where we are. I think Mike's correct that everybody would agree that tax simplification is a dream we'd love to see come true. But if we should agree that some additional stimulus on the fiscal side is needed under current circumstances, and if we believe that unleashing spending is not a wise thing, then one is left to taxes. And if one is left to taxes, it seems to me there are 2 important needs, if one agrees the stimulus is needed: to increase disposable income and to increase business investment. Those are the things we need. And to get those, obviously a reduction immediately for a temporary period in the withholding tax. I mean, we not only reduce some form of tax, a credit of payroll against taxes, but it should then immediately reduce withholding, and tomorrow the money is in a form of disposable income. In the case of business investment, it may be for a temporary period of the next 2 years that any business investment, a company should have the option to write it off today, tomorrow, over any period it wants, so that it would have an incentive to move forward in some of its capital spending program. Now, those may not be but those kind of principles of getting business investment, those may not be the right answers, but get business investment, get disposable income, get them in a relatively short time for a temporary period until we can assess whether we need the stimulus or whether we need to withdraw and go back to the discipline, fiscal discipline, that has served us so well and we need to reestablish.
Neither of which takes us closer to, as you point out, to simplified tax code. Yes, Senator Schultz.
One of the reasons why Milton Friedman won his Nobel Prize was his massive study of consumption. And in the process of making that study and trying to figure out how to explain consumption patterns, he developed a distinction between permanent income and transitory income. And you look at the evidence, and it's pretty clear that people don't change their behavior much when they have certain transitory income that comes their way. It takes a permanent change, and then you get a change in behavior. So these things, give everybody $100 or something, I just think it's ridiculous. It's not going to do any good. You've got to do something that has a more systemic effect.
Could I advocate the ridiculous for a moment?
Help yourself. $200?
Well, with a special bonus for bankers. But as George said, there is the theory of permanent income and so forth. On the other hand, George, I think it is also probably true, and there's George has done tons of academic work done in this area, that as you start talking about low-income workers, and particularly people who are at levels such that they don't pay income tax, only pay Social Security taxes, you might get a substantially higher propensity to spend. In other words, people who live from week to week might be in a different position than the people whose, I've forgotten the phrase that's used, but people whose spending is based on their permanent income. And that's the theory, at least, that lies behind the idea of rebates for lower and middle income people.
Let's shift to the international side and talk a little bit about exchange rates, and if we can, maybe the International Monetary Fund. Secretary Blumenthal, you you ran the Treasury when, not too many years after the collapse of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system. So, and you dealt with a world of where the dollar was under a great deal of pressure at times. How much time does a modern Treasury Secretary have to spend, and should spend, intervening in the exchange rate markets, rhetorically or with your other policy tools? Is it possible? Is that something you have to do nowadays?
I thought you were going to ask how much time does he spend worrying about exchange rates and talking to his counterparts, which is a different question. How much time does he spend intervening? I would say you should spend as little time as possible intervening, because it doesn't work. I think intervention, at least my experience was intervention is no way to counteract basic forces in the international marketplace. It can, at certain times, perhaps do something to give a certain signal or to try to burn the fingers of the speculators for a day or a week, but it has no impact on permanent problem for the dollar or in the international exchange rate markets. I concluded, because I was there during a very, very difficult period during the second energy crisis, we were accused of talking the dollar down, and all of this is ridiculous, because you can't talk the dollar down or up, except for a day or two or three again, but not on a permanent basis. That I concluded that the basic economic forces, how well an economy is doing, as against our economy is doing in a world context, have a lot more to do. It's really these are the fundamental forces that determine exchange rates and sentiment in the market, in the international marketplace. And intervention, except in times of extreme emergency, September 11th, I think, is probably a day or a period when you want to get together with all your counterparts and talk about intervention for a short period of time to stabilize the market, but certainly not to have an impact on the fundamental direction of the market over time.
Well, Secretary Baker, I recall the Louvre Accords, which you were one of the architects of, which was, if not a fixed rate regime in total, was certainly something where you were coordinating with some of your counterparts. Do you agree with
Well, I agree with what Mike said, and I heard him say that intervention per se doesn't work, and it doesn't work because markets will overwhelm it. On the other hand, I heard him say that what you do want to do as Treasury Secretary is get together with your counterparts overseas in the major currency countries and coordinate to the extent that you can the underlying economic fundamentals, so that you can promote exchange rate stability. That's what the Plaza was all about. That's what the Louvre was all about. It wasn't about intervention. Now, you might intervene as a part of that to send a signal, because the market will take a signal, but the intervention itself is never going to overwhelm the market, and the market is going to set the exchange rates. To the extent that you can coordinate the underlying fundamentals, you can promote stability in exchange rates. It takes a lot of work. It's really hard because those fundamentals are out of balance because of political reasons. As Bob's shaking his head, and he knows. And getting Japan, for instance, to do what maybe she doesn't want to do, and the United States to do what it doesn't want to do, and Germany to do what it doesn't want to do, so that the imbalances or the underlying economic fundamentals can be coordinated, is damn tough politically. But if you can get it done, it works.
Secretary Rubin, do you ever foresee a time when the U.S. dollar U.S. would attempt to get some kind of exchange rate union with the euro?
Ever foresee is a long time, but it doesn't seem to me that it's a very sensible kind of arrangement to have. It's very hard to imagine going to see if we're in a recession, or say, if our economy is soft, going to say to the president, unfortunately, Mr. President, the economy is very soft, but because of the dollar, we're going to have to raise taxes or cut spending. I think that would be an interesting conversation, but not a very happy one.
And yet
No.
that's essentially what the countries in Europe are undertaking, is it not?
Under my strict, they basically have coordinated their policies, and yeah, I think it's a little different, though, Paul. They've sort of adopted a current fiscal policy to support, or the fiscal disciplines to support a common currency. I think that's.
But they've got a terrible problem from a macroeconomic standpoint. Wouldn't you agree, Bob? I mean, how do you coordinate the fiscal policies of 15 countries with one monetary policy? I mean, we have trouble doing it with one monetary policy and one fiscal policy in this country.
Yeah, I do think they've got a lot of.
Nobody's proved it works.
Does that mean that we can never return, Secretary Schultz, to the Bretton Woods world where we do attempt to at least have some kind of stable exchange rate regime? Are we living in a world of fiat currencies for, as far as you can tell, for quite a while?
Yes.
Anybody disagree with that? Does anybody disagree with that?
Well, what you really want is clearing rates that clear. And if you try to fix them, and you have bad policies, you pay. And but the floating rate is a market adjusting system, and if you don't create clearing rates, then you'll be punished for it. So I think it's a much better system than trying to have the old Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system.
I say yes, but
I think that when you
agree totally with what Jim was saying and others were inferring, that doesn't mean you don't work it. The job of having a sound economy yourself and trying to encourage others to do likewise and do it on as much of a collaborative basis as you can so that you have stability. Stability is very desirable.
maybe I can coax some disagreement on something regarding the International Monetary Fund, because Secretary Schultz, you obviously dealt with the fund when you were at Treasury, and yet I think I read an op-ed piece in my favorite newspaper urging saying that the IMF had served its purpose, and that you might encourage its abolition. Can you elaborate on that? And because I assume some other people here might think that the IMF is a pretty good policy tool.
Well, I think it's done a lot of damage, and therefore we should examine whether or not we should get rid of it. And I made that proposal, and I testified before the Congress advocating that, and the Congress thereupon took action that increased the amount of money available to the IMF by about $90 billion. So I've concluded I'm not going to get my way, so I have a next step. And I was interested in, I wish that Larry Summers were here, because I testified on one occasion. Right after he did, we were there together in the hearing room. And he said at the end of the hearing that he thought the IMF should return to and focus and do what he regarded as its core function, which had to do with helping in currency crises, balance of payments problems that arise from time to time, and trying to avoid them. So I say, well, okay, if we've got to have one, let's do that, but let's change the charter so that the IMF is restricted just to that. They can't do anything else. Because I think one of the problems is that it's a gigantic amount of money now. Hard to tell exactly how much, but probably on the order of $200 billion. And it's a honeypot. It really can be used for anything the President of the United States plus a couple of other leaders decide they want to use it for. And so you get fiascos, like what happened in Russia.
But can't they come in handy once in a while? For example, right now when we're trying to coax Pakistan into an alliance?
I think that's the worst kind of way to use the IMF, to use this pot of money to do something that we don't think we can persuade the Congress or in some other way get accountable, responsible money to do. Use the IMF to bribe people to do something or other. That's terrible.
George, when you were Secretary of State and I was Secretary of the Treasury.
Why it's so important to restrict the IMF.
George, are you saying you can't use the IMF for political purposes? Because when you were Secretary of State and I was Secretary of the Treasury, I remember a number of occasions when you said, this is really important that we make this loan to this country. And when I was Secretary of State, I felt the same way.
Well, I think it was a mistake. And just because we made mistakes doesn't mean they aren't mistakes.
Well, let me say.
I think, for example, I think that the policies that were followed, and Don may disagree with this violently, toward Latin America in the 1980s were made possible by the fact that the IMF was there. The amounts of money were piddling by today's standards. But nevertheless, a series of interventions with various countries were took place, and the programs were be restrictive, do things that will promote exports, lower your exchange rate because you have a big debt. And what was really the motivation? I think you'd have to say, in all honesty, the motivation was that we had some major banks in this country that had been very unwise in their loans. They were heavily overexposed, and the object was to protect them. Now you have to say to yourself, what was the impact on the people of Latin America? It was devastating. And we had a lost decade. And I think it's just wrong. And the IMF's program suggestions were wrong. I'm criticizing when I was in office. I'll come to you if you want to, but
No doubt you will, George.
but I think it's a bad thing.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we have...
Let Bob-
Bob, no, please, go ahead.
He has to speak on behalf of the banks, after all.
Well,
No,
well, you-
this is not, we don't have time to get into, I think it's an immensely complicated question, because clearly, financial crisis, you have these vast flows in a vastly more complicated international financial system, and financial crisis can have impacts that are profoundly important throughout the globe. I think had we not intervened in Mexico, I think there's at least a possibility, and that worked rather quickly, that we could have had horrendous problems flowing from that. On the other hand, that created moral hazard issues, or may have created moral hazard issues, George, which I think were a significant negative aspect of doing that. I think on balance we did the right thing. So I think the IMF system is a system with enormous problems associated with it, but having said that, I still think we're a lot better off with it than without it, until somebody can think of a better way of dealing with financial crisis in the world we now live in.
You know, our institutions may be imperfect, but every Secretary of the Treasury ought to be thinking about what's over the horizon and how we deal with the long-term threats that we saw personified on September 11th. By the middle of this century, we're going to have 10 billion people, and they're going to be in parts of the world that today are suffering from poverty. And unless we can find a way to provide for those number of people and give them nurture and education and jobs and opportunity, we're liable to have a great deal more poverty, and we're liable to have a lot more threats that come from despair. So we also have to think ahead about those things. So our international institutions and the way to address that problem are imperfect, may not be doing the job. We should be thinking about how we can make them do the job.
Well, on that note, I think we have exhausted this panel, and I appreciate your attention. I'm afraid we don't have time for questions. I've been instructed to wrap it up. But thank you all very much for your attention, and thanks to my colleagues and mentors on the panel.
Mike, thank you for coming. I've enjoyed it.